The case study for this week is on strategic conservation planning. We're going to begin this conversation with your reading, which really pulls from the Genesee Land Trust Strategic Conservation Plan. One of the things that I wanted to point out about this plan, I hope you picked this up from the reading, is that this was actually one of the early strategic conservation plans that was produced by a group of students at Cornell University. Ulla is how you pronounce, at least that's my understanding, how you pronounce Ulla Amundsen is the author, who has also gone ahead and contributed to the Strategic Conservation Planning Handbook for the Land Trust Alliance. And so this was one of his early efforts with students. I think it's an important effort to look at how we're starting to bring together research about the region together with strategic conservation planning. Just a real quick overview of where this lecture is going to go. I'm going to kind of walk through the assignment, some of the pieces I feel are important, and then we're going to move into kind of a process discussion at the end, just bring up some big points. All right, make sure that you go ahead and participate in the online portion of this assignment, and we'll talk about it a bit more in class next week. One of the first portions of the assignment is actually to go in and specifically focus for a minute on the history and the demographic sections of this plan. I think it's important that this is incorporated into your thought process on every project that we work on, is that, to be honest, we're very, very good in most cases about understanding the ecological components of a plan. We have data available. You've learned in GIS how to go and analyze that data, right? It becomes very easy. But to be honest, most people and their reactions to any kind of proposals in a landscape are guided by the history of that plan. Here on this slide, I've actually gone ahead and pulled in a quote from Eric Sonnleitner, a student who actually graduated a year ago, where he talks about kind of the importance of the landscape in terms of kind of broader symbols and how they associate with it. And he talks about how this went from being the flower landscape, as in the production of wheat, to the flower landscape as it relates to growing beautiful, landscape plants and flowers. Realistically, I think what's embedded underneath this is that even with this section here, Eric's pointing out that there's not a lot of information, and I think that's something that's important. So hopefully you caught on to similar things in your own discussion posts. A few more points here on the history, but more specifically on the demographics of the region. One of the disconnects that students always identify with this one is that, okay, you presented some historical information, and then more importantly maybe, you went ahead and presented some information about where the communities are growing. As the quotes point out here, right, it would have been helpful to determine if lands close to high density populations, how that fit into their decision-making process. To be honest with you, and there's a little bit more information on some upcoming slides, but I don't think it actually did. The second quote from Nick Krupp actually says that I know it was up to the land trust to prioritize what they thought was important, but why would you present all this demographic information and talk about the growing parts of this region and then largely disregard it as you go on to protect properties or put a plan together to do so? And here's that map I was referring to a minute ago. And so I hope you took an opportunity when you're going through the reading to focus in on this population change map and what it actually tells you in terms of, some of the larger threats or issues that the land trust is dealing with here. And so one of the things that's going to jump out here is that you're seeing Rochester, kind of that green center inner city area, right? It'd be awesome if this map was better and actually showed us highways and some context information rather than just having the county by county analysis you're seeing here. Because I think what we're seeing is we have first ring suburbs that are largely growing, very quickly, but then we have these rural growth pressures that are probably along transportation corridors, but not enough information is presented here. Justin Johnson over here on the right says is that, look, we're seeing this incredible population in the upstate area grew, by only 2.6% over a 15-year period, but at the same time increased in urban land by 30%. And what he's saying is that that's not a lot of population, but the total land area being taken under is pretty significant. That needs to be what's driving the plan. The data's here, the story's here. It's not being seen in the decision-making process. And again, we go down to Bailey and her comments along the same line is, right, here's the red flag. Right, here's a major concern. Where is this in the plan? This, in her mind, this seems like a perfect opportunity for the Genesee Land Trust to make themselves known and grow positive connections with a growing number of landowners to improve conservation in this landscape before sprawl moves in and it's too late to stop. Moving on to the next, piece of information that a student has pulled out is looking at where comprehensive planning has and hasn't been done, right? And so, one of the things that jumps off this map is that comprehensive planning is actually relatively common in this region. There are a few areas where it's either, when they say not determined, my suspicion is it's in process, unfinished, it hasn't been a priority yet. And so there are the light brown areas, the red areas, to be honest, are less advanced on their comprehensive planning. Otherwise, a team that was working in this region, especially planners, would have known where those plans are at or been able to locate information about them. The point that's being made down here at the bottom is that we can study comprehensive plans and determine what communities have made a significant investment in prioritizing the goals of land protection, putting strategic plans in place and possibly funding in place, which I think that's the open space plans that you see kind of highlighted in some of the green counties here, right? Those are important parts of this conversation. Where is the quality of resources to respond to this problem? The land trust needs to be taking that into account as well. This map starts to focus in on, kind of the second part of the assignment, which is, what's one key map, graphic, or otherwise that helps you best understand it? If this was your task to develop a strategic conservation plan for this region, amongst the information that was presented to you, which maps would you be drawn to help you make your decisions? So one of those possibilities that sits out here, and this is Taylor Christensen from a few years ago, she focused in on protecting prime farmland, right? Understanding the pattern of prime farmland, farmland of statewide importance, these are designations that I think are really critical. Now, I would also put a word of caution into this. These are also layers that are often readily available, provided at a statewide scale, and sometimes aren't very good. Another map that was proposed was rare, threatened, and endangered species within the study area. This is one of those ones that, going back to the mission and the goals of the land trust, this starts helping understand where they went. Now think back to that, how you would start to combine information together. Where was growth occurring within the region? Where is that overlapping with endangered, threatened, rare wildlife and plant species, right? And things of special concern. One of the things you can see, and again, the maps are very poor in terms of helping you understand this overlay, is that the Rochester region kind of sits in that dip in the shoreline, right about just left of center on the map. That's a region that actually, the outlying portions of it have a lot of threatened species. Now, it probably makes sense because urban development is probably the threat. But again, the maps here have the right information, but they're not helping us understand the story. They're not doing a good job of communicating the kind of details that people need to be informed about this decision process. And one of the maps that I hope we all kind of got to, right, is that the suitability analysis map is something that I think is an important part of this. As we've been talking about in class this semester, suitability analysis is really kind of this evaluation step. It's where we're starting to pull together those underlying pieces of information and bring them together into, an evaluation of where the landscape is working well and where it's not. In this case, I actually look at this map and I struggle to see how this is reflecting some of the information that's been presented so far. And so I want you to really critically think about this map. How would you improve the suitability analysis to better reflect what you've read in the case study? And the results of that poor suitability analysis, I think, starts to come up in some of the things that students identify in this case study as missing information. Right? They immediately kind of jump to, yes, you showed us land cover, but you didn't actually present us with enough information to understand the change over time and understand not just that regionally urban sprawl is a threat. Right? We talked about it a minute ago. Population's not growing that quickly. The land area that's being consumed is disproportionate to that small population growth. We know it, but we don't fully see it in the mapping that's provided to us, and it certainly isn't visible in the suitability analysis map. And down here at the bottom, I think the other thing that we start to jump into is that, that carries over. We see a map of threatened and endangered species and species of special concern, but we're not actually getting a real detailed map of habitat change and loss. Where can we actually intervene to make a difference? What I'm suggesting is this is a good case study, but we need to do a better job. And so this all kind of jumps back You know, you've seen this slide before. You've seen me. You've heard me talk about this, right? Landscape suitability analysis didn't emerge with land trusts trying to do strategic conservation planning. This is an application of a set of methods that we continue to evolve over time. One of the things that people get hung up on is that, especially land trusts, is that we get stuck on producing every possible layer and then we run out of time to do really good analysis work. I think it's critical to start thinking through, right? If you were to work your way into a project, how would you lay out a layered cake representation like is sitting here on the screen? What is the critical information that you need to map, right? Step back to that. The process, the current conditions, you know, what are the critical pieces of information that we have access to that can help inform the next step, which is the evaluation of that to identify priorities for conservation, suitable areas for growth, all of these other things. When we talk about suitability analysis, it's defined by the question, the project that we're working on. And remember, we don't have to reinvent our process every single time, right? One of the things that this case study does present is it talks about comprehensive planning. Well, let's remember that that's kind of the backdrop to everything we're doing here. Comprehensive planning, the adaptive components of that, right? One of the things we need to get better at doing is we need to get better at kind of working our way through this process. We need to define the problem. Some of the issues with the data that's presented in this case study, the maps that are presented, or maybe even the suitability analysis overall, is that I think in some ways they kind of loosely identify the issues. They don't actually cleanly go in and present a case for this is, you know, this is occurring and here is evidence, you know, A, B, and C that helps us explain where and to what extent it's happening, and then also, like, is there a potential to do anything about it, right? Sprawl is different in different areas, right? Some areas might be growing more slowly, some might be growing more quickly. If a new highway is already under construction, we can bet that there's going to be a lot more growth that comes right in behind it because of induced demand. How does that kind of fit into this broader framework? We don't have to reinvent ourselves to do planning for conservation organizations. What we have to do is we have to bring our process, we have to adapt, and we have to work within these communities to get better results, to arrive at better alternatives and selecting the best plan, working our way through a transparent decision-making process. And a lot of this jumps back to where do we begin? Well, there's a reason that I'm layering these case studies together. Is I think a good example of how we've grown and built our process well above and beyond where things started with the Genesee Land Trust and the Cornell Working Group is that the Greening and the Crossroads plan that we read earlier in the semester, that's how we start to go back and integrate this into a better planning process. And just to put a plug in there, the other thing that we should start to be thinking about is how do we collect social values, cultural values, and how do we integrate that into our process? I'll probably go ahead in a couple of weeks in class and bring up this map viewer for you, but what I'll tell you is this is a research project that was done out in Colorado. It was done using online methods, but these can easily be done in public meetings as well, to identify locations where people, in this particular case, see different threats affecting the landscape and being able to layer them on top of one another. What you're effectively doing is using local knowledge to identify the hot spots in the landscape where conservation intervention is necessary. And lastly, how does this apply back to our work? The suitability analysis process you just went through was largely based on the biological and physical conditions of the landscape, bringing in a little bit of infrastructure, bringing in a little bit of recreation need, but largely, how would we include a stakeholder group? We'll have an opportunity to interact with stakeholders in a few weeks, mostly focused in on what's going on in a neighborhood, you know, at neighborhood design scale. But one of the other things that I want you to start thinking about as a planner is that how do you collect better information? How do we include more stakeholders in the process? How can summarizing that information and presenting it back to them as a map be an effective way to communicate kind of broader community values? All right, thanks for listening, and I'll catch up with you in class.